way. So, and I think that when you
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. So as you see, we've changed seats, and I will try to moderate the second session as good as possible. Lorena, you must be very popular. Apparently, there were many or quite some people in the audience who came especially for you and had to go back now. But we have some more very interesting speakers lined up for this afternoon, starting with Maya Capello of Agicom, the Italian regulator, who, as was told before, on a voluntary basis already implemented the monitor. So I'm very happy that you are here to share your experiences about how Agicom is dealing with pluralism and the internet. And I forgot to mention that you're also on the board of EPRA, the European body of audiovisual regulators, and that you're vice chair since 2 years, if I remember well. 4 years already. Sorry. So we're going to start with your presentation, since Filippo is still making a phone call apparently. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Did it work? Yes. I pushed a word button. It's okay. Okay. No, maybe 3 years. Yeah. It's first of all an honor to be here. It's like coming back to friends all the time. So really, thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop in my double capacity, both of as vice chair of EPRA and of as a head of unit in the Media Services Directorate at Agicom. It's especially with the cap of EPRA, I was invited in the first place, and then I asked explicitly to also mention that I belong to national regulator, and this will also explain why I will maybe touch more some general issues rather than referring only to the Italian situation. I guess most of you here are familiar with EPRA, so I don't think it's necessary to spend many words, but we have some guests from that maybe are not that familiar, so I really allow me just a 30-second spots on EPRA, which is a platform, an informal cooperation platform of 53 members. They are coming from 47 countries. They are all regulators of the audiovisual. Some of them are converged, like Agicom, others are not. So they have somehow different fields of intervention in their activities, but they have in common that they share common interests on audiovisual policy. We also have 4 permanent observers in the EPRA, which is the EU Commission, and Lorena has been guest at our last meeting in Vilnius, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the European Observatory, European Audiovisual Observatory. EPRA doesn't adopt common position, but is a very active think tank on most issues related with audiovisual policy, and pluralism has been one of the leading topic ever since EPRA was set up in 1995. It's starting to become quite a long period of time. Pluralism is one of the most recurrent issues. And this is particularly interesting probably because when we look at the topics that we are dealing with during our meetings, we see that there are always some recurrent ones. Protection of minors and pluralism are probably the most frequent that we deal with, and this is also probably because they are the ones that reflect more than others the fact that there are changes in the environment that affects regulators in their activity. What I would like to try to do in I think I have 10-15 minutes or something. Yeah, okay. I wanted to start from really trying to explore the title of this session, which is New Parameters for a Plurality Regulation on the Internet. I think there are 3 important topics within this title of the session. The parameters, the issue of what is new and what is old, the issue of plurality regulation, and if this is something that is different from pluralism, why we're not speaking about regulation of pluralism, but regulation of plurality. And then the core thing, which is what are we talking about? Where is internet and where are the borders of regulators, and which toolkit do we have? I will not be able to give probably any answer to all these questions, but I will be very happy if this can trigger some reflection. So I will just try to explore also on the basis of what is happening behind the scenes in the regulator's office on these things. New and old, as Peggy anticipated, AGICOM has already made a test of the Media Pluralism Monitor, so it was particularly interesting to see and to listen to the what was said earlier this morning about the evolution of the MPM. This evolution, we felt when we did the test that it was maybe a bit early to talk about the internet. So these were the questions where we were not able to provide many answers. Maybe we wouldn't be that much more able nowadays either, because these are data that are not always central and collected by regulators. So it's really difficult to define what are the parameters. When we speak about parameters, we need that we have something certain, some criteria that act as borders for the evaluation. That is the essence of a parameter. But to find out that, it's probably crucial to start from looking at the market structure that is necessarily different from what we were talking about previously. And I wanted just to take back the notes that I took this morning. The new profiles that were mentioned as to be considered, if I noted down correctly, was unequal internet access issues, unequal production of content, and unequal online freedom. These were the three main things that I heard as being mentioned as possible new tools being used for defining the new parameters. And I couldn't agree more, because what we have seen when dealing with pluralism in the traditional sector is that we are used to very traditional parameters, mainly, at least in Italy, two ones: economical resources, and the second one, the integration of the operators. This is something very traditional. And when we applied the test of the Media Monitor, what we realized, first of all, what is that it managed to open our minds to what traditional legislation hardly ever puts on paper. And this was a very, very useful experience, not because we wanted to find an answer. And I really like very much how it is defined. It is not a therapy, but it's useful to say what is the sickness. No? So it's the diagnosis that should come out from the application of the monitor. And our health didn't appear to be that bad from the test. We got many green lights. We got also many red lights, and some of them were surprising. And I think this as well is something that could help very much regulators. And I am very happy that you are planning to involve regulators in your activity. You didn't mention who were the 9 happy countries, but should Italy be among the 9, the lucky 9? Of course, AGICOM will be very helpful to provide relevant data. And as to the specific question that was mentioned, if EPRA could also be helpful in gathering information, I think that, of course, we will be very helpful to provide with useful contacts and to really make life easier for you in getting in touch with the right person. So I think this is really something that you can count on. This is not the first time EPRA is involved with activities of the School of Regulation, so it's absolutely something that we are very happy to say yes to. And but don't be sure that you will get all your answers that you believe that you will get. That is really a warning, because from the exercise that we made, we also realized that many of these data were difficult to find, and AGICOM is a relatively relatively big body. We are a convergent authority, as most of you know, and we have also availability of and access to many sources of data. This is not the case for maybe smaller regulators and with less resources. And many of the analyses that are required for the application of the tool, they are also quite costly. And costs, well, as far as I understood, you are now doing this test, but I imagine in the future when this monitor will live its own life and get out of the pilot activity, there might be a scenario where we have one central body doing this, I don't know, or that all regulators are applying the tools on themselves. Maybe they find it that attractive that they will choose to do it. I think even if it's just on a voluntary basis, it is a very useful activity in order to find out internally what is needed. And as most regulators can also act on policy by suggesting solutions to their own government. This is something that, for example, at AGICOM, we do quite often. If we realize in applying the rules that there is something that is not adequately working, we have a specific power to signal that to the government. And I am sure that if regulators also signal something to the Commission, they will be happy to listen to us. That is at least what we think, and I am also sure that they will be happy to help if there is something that appears to be solved at a more central level. I think there is very much room for cooperation, independently of the issue of being competent, yes or not, because we are talking about measures that are not necessarily legislative ones, but there are tools, there are instruments. So in defining new parameters, coming back to the new profiles that were mentioned this morning, I really think they are key issues. Internet access is not only linked to what we are usually now accustomed to monitor. Access to internet means also looking at infrastructures, digital divide, geographical distributions, investments on digital agenda in general. So the independently on the fact that it is established as a right in the Constitution or not. We are talking about access to internet of quality. You know, if we want to make sure that audiovisual content is even possible, if you don't have proper bandwidth, you wouldn't access it at all. So this is really a precondition that you have access to, that you have proper access to an infrastructure that allows you to get what you want. And then the production. Well, we have seen this morning the linguistical issues. Well, not only the production means also what is the integration of the usual providers of content. We are used to assess the integration in our traditional world. Now we have web companies that are a little bit destabilizing us in carrying out our missions, because they are not the subjects that we are used to deal with. They are not our usual counterparts, or not counterparts, but at least stakeholders with whom we have relations to. So this will absolutely be very challenging. And of course, the online freedom issue as well. And privacy protection was also mentioned this morning. This is something that must go hand in hand in order to allow that audiovisual content is made available, because the cultural industry will have the chances to make this still profitable. So the issue of new and old probably will imply, at least according to our experience, that there will be maybe some mixed parameters that could be applicable both for the traditional world and for the new one, but maybe some new ones, they will need to be defined in order to take into account the specificities of the internet. Then my second point, which is the plurality regulation. We are used to talk about pluralism. That is the concept that we are used to in our traditional media landscape. Internal pluralism, external pluralism, public service broadcasting. These are the concepts that we usually deal with in our traditional media world. But on the internet, which is certainly a plural market, because we have many different operators there, is not necessarily a pluralistic one when we have a look at who is providing the information or who is able to access the information. We have new gatekeepers. We mentioned search engines were mentioned today. Search engines, of course, they have one specific function: to ensure that people who want something find it. That is their business, and they of course do it in the way they find it most profitable. But when these search engines start to be integrated in the new connected TV sets, and they have to compete with the inside search engines of the allowed by the electronic program guides inside the TV sets, or the search engines that are proprietary ones, well, then we are seeing a new form of competition as to who is able to ensure access to programs and information. And then this is a part where we regulators don't work that much at the moment, because there are no clear rules on this issue, apart from an ex post intervention, of course, when there are distortions to competition. But speaking as a regulator, so as an ex ante regulator, this is not a field where all possible solutions have yet been explored. So I think this is a sector where there are many questions that are still to be put on paper. First of all, who we are going to regulate. This is really the first issue. Who are our new players? Our toolkits at the moment are the Audiovisual Media Services Directive and the E-Commerce Directive, which leads us to a quite well identified set of subjects, which are on the internet, the intermediate service providers. And then we have a more general category of the providers of information society service providers, which have not that been explored by national regulations, at least in Italy not, and not even in other countries in that way that the same ex-ante rules have been even thought as being applicable to these subjects. And I don't even think that would be respectful of the approach of the e-commerce directive. So here we are in a world where the asymmetry is very strong. We have subjects that go under the Audiovisual Media Services Directive with a editorial responsibility and ex-ante regulation, and other subjects who are not defined as responsible unless certain conditions apply. So this is the second question: not only who, but also under which conditions are we able to apply certain regulation. And then, of course, what we want to regulate. Do we really want to regulate everything? Maybe that would not be realistic. We need to regulate what is essential in order to deal with these three important issues that were highlighted this morning. So access, production, and online freedom. If we have these in mind, probably we will also see that not everything needs to be regulated. But access to information is probably becoming the key issue where some form of regulation might be useful to set up. And this leads me then to the third thing I wanted to mention, that is the scope, so the internet and the players. I mentioned the intermediate service providers, and I would really just like to mention a few words on what we are doing in Italy and in trying to finally adopt a regulation on copyright infringement, because this is what we it's the issue where we have approach very closely these new subjects. It's the first regulatory activity where we really try to answer this question of the responsibility on the net. And we are really realizing that it is really very difficult to combine effective responsibility with the toolkit that we have. The toolkit doesn't only mean what we can do, but also to whom, with regards to whom we are able to apply these instruments. And if copyright regulation is crucial in order to allow the content industry to survive, it is also true that it must not prevent one of the three issues here, which is online freedom. So how to ensure this balance is also a question that regulators have to pose themselves. What to do then? Well, we have, I think everybody read with big interest the green paper on convergence, and this is really a debate that had probably just started. Nothing, as far as I can feel at least, is going to happen now in the very immediate future, but it's undoubted. I mean, it's really without doubt that this is a sector where we all have to work. And this is also a moment where being convergent is probably a very good, very, very helpful. It allows to have a broader, probably, view on which are the implications of the different subjects, what is possible to do in which case and what in another one. But where also cooperation is the most important thing, because we are talking here about global players, and one regulator alone, even if they are going to apply a media pluralism and monitor on the internet, well, these answers will probably not be that helpful in the end. Well, what if we get some red lights? What can we in Italy do alone if we don't act in a coordinated way with the other regulators? I don't think we could be able to do anything. Then this tool would be useless if applied, if being applicable to the internet would not allow to take then any consequent action. So this tool is, I think, to be welcomed. It's a very important tool, but please don't let it be just something in the ivory tower where we make studies that are far from reality, because we regulators, we need then something that we can use in practice. So if we get these red scores and then don't have the tools to try to put some remedy on it, then I think this would only be remain as an exercise, which is useful, will open our minds, but then not lead to anything. So this is really my very small suggestion in confirming the availability of really giving access to all relevant data that are crucial for this exercise to be played. But let us also consider what will happen then, and so that it is not only an exercise. I think I will really just stop here, and then I will be happy to participate to the debates and give room to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, for adding such interesting elements to the debate. Just one point for clarification. So you mentioned this regulation on copyright infringement. Is it a draft, something that is in preparation, or is it already published?
No, it's a draft regulation that is a public consultation. It has been notified to the Commission, but not to Lorena. Well, it has been. DG Connect is also involved, actually. We have DG Markt, DG Connect, and DG Just, who are involved in the under the Transparency Directive. So we notified at the beginning of September, and we have a standstill until the 3rd of December. So it will be adopted probably by the end of the year, unless we get from Brussels red lights, talking about red lights. But we have just ended the national consultation. We had the last hearing on the last week. The 30th of October was our last day. We had 5 weeks with very intense consultations and hearings. We had a huge participation, where there were 56 participants, and there were almost only associations, which means that there are really many companies behind, and also associations, civil society. We got also reports from abroad. Is there a problem, Mike? No? And we really get many interesting comments during the consultation, and most of them related exactly with what I mentioned here. So to who and what. which is really the big question. And the e-commerce directive, the more I read it, well, the more surprises I really get, because it's an old text, but it's also a very modern one. There were many answers that can be found. Reading, especially the recitals, they were very much forward-looking, I think. But of course, business models have developed a lot since then. The directive is 13 years older now, and it doesn't always reflect probably what is developing as to the economical models of the companies, but the main structures, they are absolutely fully applicable, and that is what we are sticking to. So it's available on the TRIS website of the Commission, because it has been translated into English, German, and French. So it's fully available on the Commission's website in these languages.
Interesting. Thank you so much. So I agree that we proceed like before lunch. We have the 3 presentations first, and then we open the floor for the debate. So I'm happy now to introduce you to our second speaker, Filippo Donati, who is teaching here in Florence, the University of Florence, so downtown, or how should, in the city center. And his area of expertise is constitutional law, and you're also a practicing lawyer. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the European University Institute and for the Center for having organized such an interesting debate. So I want to, Maya just posed 2 crucial questions regarding regulation on internet: who and what? And I would like to add some more questions. I would like to relate with the initial remark of Pierluigi Parcu, who said that internet challenges the traditional notion of pluralism. So the 2 questions I would like to raise are the following. First of all, are traditional instruments directed to promote pluralism with respect to traditional media be appropriate for the internet world? And if we answer no, as I deem, how much can internet neutrality, so the idea, the principle of internet neutrality, work for the safeguard and promotion of information in internet? So let's start from the principle of pluralism, media pluralism. We all know what is the meaning of this principle. It doesn't need further investigation in this now in this moment. But of course, basically speaking, we all know that the principle of pluralism lies on the assumption that concentration may limit the number of voices that have access to the media. And therefore, this principle is intended to promote the so-called free marketplace of ideas, so an ideal market where consumers and users may have access to a wide range of different ideas and information. So we all know that this marketplace of ideas has an enormous economic value, but we are all convinced that this market cannot be addressed only with the tools of competition law, because it's a market which is strictly linked to democracy, and pluralism of ideas and information is a precondition for democracy to work. And as the framework directive clearly stated, competition rules alone cannot be sufficient to ensure diversity and media pluralism. So therefore, legislators in each country have devised a set of measures in order to protect and promote pluralism. And those measures are basically drafted through the imposition of certain thresholds. So, for instance, in Italy, we have a limit in the economic revenues of each operator, which is related to a very big market, the so-called integrated communication system, the SIC, whereby nobody alone or in a group could reach more than 20% of the general economic revenues. And in addition, we have further limitations on the number of channels and a general prohibition of acquiring a dominant position in each single market of this big integrated communication system. In other countries, we know there are other limits, for instance, the limit of audience. And what is the point? The point is that the Italian legislator and the Italian National Regulatory Authority are both convinced, or seems to be both convinced, that the prohibition of acquiring a dominant position in the traditional media sector should be extended also in the internet world. And to this extent, a recent legislation, Italian legislation, has included online advertising revenues in the market that should be considered for the acquisition of a dominant position, which is prohibited by Italian law. And the Italian Regulatory Authority has started an investigation in order to verify whether there is a dominant position in the online advertising. So the idea is that if an ISP has a dominant position in the advertising market, that would be a position contrary to the principle of pluralism. I believe that this approach is not fully convincing for a number of reasons. First of all, the prohibition of a dominant position is clearly directed to promote pluralism, so to stimulate the marketplace of the ideas. But we all know that internet is not only the marketplace of ideas. So many other transactions are made in internet. Many other transactions are made which are clearly outside the free marketplace of ideas. So when I buy an item on Amazon, or I buy an item on eBay, or I exercise any other right through the internet, I do not exercise the freedom of information. So this means that any kind of measure which is intended to prohibit the acquisition of a dominant position in the internet world should make a distinction between those transactions which are included in the marketplace of ideas and those transactions which are instead clearly outside that marketplace. So you cannot impose a prohibition of dominant position justified by the need to promote pluralism for those transactions, those activities which are outside the marketplace of ideas. The second problem is that, and we have, Maya has just explained to us, is that internet has a global nature, and therefore it makes it difficult to define a relevant geographical market which is necessary in determining the existing of a dominant position. Third, the third problem is connected to the nature of the internet service providers. Portals, search engines, and so on. Because those operators are very different from traditional media operators. So generally they are intermediaries. And a search engine, for instance, simply connect end users with content providers. And therefore, in theory, even the existence of a dominant position of an ISP could not be seen as against the idea of pluralism, since they promote pluralism. They help people to get the information they need, or to disseminate the information they want to disseminate. Of course, sometimes ISP behave as content provider, and in that case you might pose the question of limiting the dominant position of ISP. But in most cases it's really not easy to draw a distinction between activities that fall within the content providing or the service providing. And I believe this topic will be addressed by Oreste Pollicino in a while. So therefore, for those three reasons, I believe it is quite difficult to simply extend in the internet world those thresholds which have been introduced with the traditional media to protect pluralism. And my assumption is that when we deal with internet, the key element to protect and to promote pluralism would be network neutrality. In order to understand the network neutrality issue, and Pierluigi, stop me if I don't know if 10 minutes more, 5 minutes more, okay? Okay, so, okay, there are different types of activity which are relevant for the network neutrality issue. First of all, provision of broadband access by network operators. Secondly, provision through the internet of content, of application, of services, of product by operators which use the internet, the so-called over-the-top operators. And third activity is the access to the internet by end users. Of course, the three kinds of activities may overlap, but that's a distinction which remains useful to understand the issues related to network neutrality. Broadband access providers have many incentives to treat internet data not in the same way and to discriminate some data. For instance, a telephone operator may have incentives to degrade the over IP services of another operator which is using its network. By the same time, there might be incentives to degrade or to block traffic toward certain sites. And of course, if each broadband operator would be left free to manage the traffic, there might be a danger for the guarantee of information pluralism. Because in order to guarantee the free flow of information, we have to guarantee that internet remains open and free. But how can we guarantee free and open internet is a crucial issue. There is a landmark case in the United States, the Verizon case versus the Federal Communication Commission, whereby Verizon and other network operators have challenged the regulation enacted by the FCC in order to guarantee network neutrality. And the argument of those operators is the following. So we do spend a lot of money, billion of dollars, trillion of dollars, in order to build or to upgrade our network, and we must be left free to use our network as we wish. So if you want to charge operators OTP for having priority access, you have to allow us, because this is the only way to give us incentives to invest in our network and to allow competition between broadband providers. On the other hand, the US government maintains an opposite position, and they say that openness of internet is necessary in order to guarantee innovation, so that new services and products could be developed, and also to guarantee freedom of information. This is a debate which is currently present also in the European Union, as we know. The European Union has enacted in 2011 a communication on the open internet and net neutrality in Europe, where the Commission has reported many cases of interference with voice of IP services or peer-to-peer services and other kind of of traffic on internet. And the Commission's conclusion was that the openness of internet should be protected, and the same position has been expressed by the European Parliament. But we don't have at European level a regulation which guarantees network neutrality. We have an article, Article 8 of a framework directive, which requires national regulatory authorities to promote the interest of citizens in accessing to information over internet. And we have an obligation of transparency imposed by the Universal Directive. But there is no definition on what is a reasonable traffic management allowed to network operators. Because we all know that any operator should be allowed to control and to manage the traffic on its network, for instance, to avoid spam or to protect to protect against cyber crimes and so on. But the measure, so what is reasonable traffic management or not, is not clear at all. So therefore we have different legislations in Europe. We have countries like Holland, but I believe the same is Germany, where we have a strict prohibition of any data traffic management, except for preserving the integrity of the network or for avoiding spam interferences and so on. On the other side, we have countries like the UK, where you have absolute freedom to manage the traffic on the internet, provided, of course, you make it in a transparent way according to the Universal Service Directive, and you do it consistently with competition law. And in this situation, for instance, Italy has no legislation at all. So, being this the picture, I will try to draw some brief conclusion. Yes, 1 minute. First of all, we all know that we have to protect and promote pluralism in internet. And if we agree on the arguments I tried to expose, it is not possible to simply extend the rules which were designed to guarantee pluralism with the traditional media. So the key factor will be, in order to promote pluralism, there is the need of two kinds of measures. First of all, promoting access to internet services, and this is a topic I don't want to even to address this topic. We already spoke about it this morning. Second is to preserve the open and neutral character of the network. So in this case, of course, we have to protect citizens and undertakings from cyber crimes. We have to protect copyright, but basically the idea is that we have to protect the openness and freedom of internet. We all know that there are many threats on internet possible. So we have recently learned from the press the case where the US government had controlled millions of citizens. We all know that China managed to shut down or to block some sites of opposition parties. In this scenario, we must be aware that internet may risk, instead of being an instrument to promote pluralism and democracy, might be a threat for those values. So we need a regulation. This regulation cannot be based on a simple transposition to internet of traditional measures used for other media, and in the end, I believe that the free and open nature of internet would be the stronger guarantees for pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filippo. I'm sure that this will trigger quite some debate, so I'm looking forward to it. But before that, I would like to give the floor to Damien Tambini, who is professor at the London School of Economics. And before that, he was involved in heading the PCMLP program in Oxford. And you are also leading the media policy project at LSE, which, if you're not familiar with that, I can recommend you to follow the blog and all the information that is there, because it's a really wealthy source of information. So happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Very happy to be here. Pier Giorgio, I put the slides on the desktop. File name is Tambini. And thank you for mentioning the Media Policy Project, particularly because we're currently negotiating a grant to extend what has been very focused on media policy in the UK to cover more European issues. So I suggest, if you haven't, you familiarise yourself. I appreciate that. I was wondering what to talk about when I received the invitation. And I have opted not to use this as an opportunity to present my research, but really to, a bit like Lorena this morning, to tell some stories and look at the case study of the UK over the last couple of years and particularly regulatory decisions which I think are relevant to creating the monitor and also to the wider debate about how regulation is going to evolve in this area. I should say that I'm not entirely convinced that net neutrality regulation alone is the solution to what have traditionally been media plurality concerns online, and I hope that it comes out from what I'm going to say exactly why. So I'm going to introduce you all to what's happened in the UK. Particularly, the Leveson inquiry was mentioned. Media plurality has been an extremely politicised issue over the last couple of years. The backdrop to that was that we had a decision by the Secretary of State on the merger situation, which involved News Corporation buying the 39% of B-Sky B that it didn't already own. And in that context, Ofcom was required to provide advice to the relevant minister, which also included the question of online services and how you introduce those to considerations about whether a merger is in the public interest, including issues of media plurality. So I'll look a little bit at the Ofcom advice, but I want to focus also on the question of media plurality as a policy objective. There's been a lot of discussion around the monitor and around the issue throughout the day. I have some concern that there is some elasticity in the concept of media plurality, which might have analytical implications for academics, but justiciability implications for the regulatory framework. And I want to speak about what could be done about media plurality online in the short term, but also mention in closing a few longer term horizon issues. So, drawing on a paper that we did for the centre I did together with Rachel, the objectives of media plurality regulation are very often quite contested and unclear. They are very broad. We looked at broadly the history of media plurality going back to the first Royal Commission on the Press, and found the following distinct objectives were mentioned in parliamentary debates and policy debate around media plurality. Maintaining the integrity of democratic process, preventing media misrepresentation and suppression of information, enhancing citizens' access to diverse information and opinion, and also protecting freedom of expression. All of these were seen as, if you like, behind the broader policy objective of media plurality. Ofcom, in its summary of media plurality objectives in the context of its advice to the Secretary of State, gave the following summary. Media plurality involves ensuring that there's a diversity of viewpoints available and consumed. And I think that's an important thing to underline. Across and within media enterprises, and preventing any one owner or voice having too much influence over public opinion and the political process. So very broad objectives and an implicit theory of the role of plural media in democracy. In the academic literature, a classic paper by Philip Napoli in the Journal of Communication in 1999 made a very important distinction between source, content, and exposure plurality. So Lorena's point this morning that, in a sense, the initial promise of the internet was of digital abundance, we have to accept that any measures have to look also about what is consumed, not only what is available in the market, but what is consumed. And you may see concentration of consumption where availability is incredibly plural. So you have a huge variety of blogs available. But what is consumed may in fact be less plural and might reflect even a narrowing and increasing concentration of sources. So the debate about media plurality has really, I think, moved on in the last few years from this, what I would call a naive assumption about digital abundance. Elie Noem, I think maybe in this building or in this room, a year ago at a presentation, made some memorable remarks about the powerful and increasing economies of scale, where you have higher production costs in new services, such as high definition, spectrum-hungry new services with increasing concentration patterns, and in fact social media and network effects enhancing some of the traditional economies of scale. More recently, a paper by Martin Cave and Richard Collins in the journal Telecommunications Policy examines the recent impact of the decline, the crisis of the advertising funding model for availability and for the creation, particularly of news that is plural. Robin Foster's report for the Reuters Institute focused on the role of intermediaries, gatekeepers, and the problem of concentration in news supply. So the idea, the naive idea of digital abundance, I think, has been consigned to the waste paper basket. So in the backdrop to these various debates, the UK Secretary of State had to, under the terms of the Communications Act 2003, offer advice to the Secretary of State on whether the proposed merger was likely to operate against the public interest, if it was likely to result in insufficient owners and insufficient plurality of content. And Ofcom did a huge amount of research and gave advice in that context. Just looking at the online element, Ofcom did, at that point in 2010, take into account online. It was not relevant to that particular decision, but it began the process of developing some measures, and particularly focusing on things like the top 50 news sites, share of page views and minutes, and also a measure which I'm going to speak about shortly, which is a subjective measure of what they call share of references. So this is more recent data, and it shows, if you look at one of those measures, the UK market in terms of a survey question asking users, which of the following do you use for news nowadays? And you can see the striking concentration of ownership around the BBC in this this slide. You could also see that Facebook. You could also. Yes, that's true. There seems to be a bias around free services online. Those, obviously, that were available freely tend to be more used. So the BBC is very concentrated, but Facebook and Google are cited by consumers as sources of news. So Ofcom's advice to government, just to shift to the question that was asked by the Secretary of State after the initial decision was the merger proposal was withdrawn by News Corporation in the context of the Leveson inquiry and the phone hacking scandal. Lord Justice Leveson made a number of recommendations for review of plurality framework in the UK, and in particular, he asked Ofcom to provide advice on the following question: could or should a review of plurality include websites, and if so, which ones? And Ofcom developed its approach, which it had initiated during the merger decision, which was a decision about therapy, to a question which is really more about, if you like, monitoring and assessment. Ofcom said the following. It said that TV and newspapers continue to play an important role, but online is emerging as a destination for news content which is likely to play a major future role in converging media. So acknowledging the importance of online then led them to develop a number of measures in terms of availability, consumption, and impact as part of its more general advice on how to implement the recommendations of the Leveson inquiry. So Ofcom has conducted a huge amount of research, finding, for example, that Facebook and Google News are used by around 1 in 5 people who use the internet as a source of news. And they concluded that online will bring significant change, but it's too soon to predict the nature of the changes. So any assessment framework, which could come out of the current policy-making cycle in the UK, should be flexible and take account of this progressive change and the shift to digital markets. Mm-hmm. In this case, I think it's Google News. But I mean, to be more precise, this is a subjective assessment made on the basis of a survey question. So there may be differences in the way respondents interpreted that question. So this is another snapshot using a slightly different measure, looking at market share. There you can see in the share of minutes and share of page views, the BBC again very dominant, but the Daily Mail and News International behind them. A revenue measure, this was obviously the approach in Italy, shows that there are, and this is an interesting indicator because it tells us a little bit about, this is not revenue, this is news expenditure. The level of concentration in spending for news gathering. Some people claiming that whilst distribution may be becoming more plural, news gathering is not. They made the estimate of no more than 600 journalists working on web news provision, 200 of whom are at the BBC. So Ofcom recommended extending any measurement regime to include online organizations within that definition of media enterprises, and they argued that any plurality review could be triggered also in transactions involving online news media providers. So I think this raises a number of cross-cutting issues which any future measure in this area would need to take account of. Obviously, there are a diversifying range of potential measures here. Share, reach, page views, etc., each of which are measured in different ways, and for the monitor, each of which are measured in quite different ways in different countries, which raises huge cross-national comparability issues and standards. The measures are different by country. How to include online? Do you have some sort of a means of translating across different platforms? How to take into account details of exposure plurality issues? Are people multi-sourcing? Are people using different media at the same time? And this is where Ofcom are developing research currently. Big policy issues is, do you include the BBC in measurement or not? Do you take into account internal plurality considerations, and how do you do that? But in general, and this is the context of the post-Leveson environment in the UK, you can see a really marked politicization of this choice of indicators, which makes it very difficult to operate in an evidence-based way. In terms of the weighting of online and the extent to which monitoring and/or therapy, as we might call it, needs to take into account, internet, I think we will agree, is becoming rapidly more important, particularly for certain demographics. And I think it's important when we think about exposure plurality to note that for young people, 16 to 24s, the internet is really probably the primary news source, and it may be that for particular demographics, that concentration, those concentration issues are more relevant, whereas for older people, television is hugely more important. We're seeing some, even since the Ofcom report, a wider debate about what kind of sources can be used, and in particular the debate about subjective measures. So the share of references measure, simply asking people what kind of news they are using, is becoming more important because of the volatility and the very quick shifts that you have in different kinds of intermediators and platforms. And here you can see some more Ofcom research on use of different platforms. I won't go into that slide because of time. So just to sum up, whilst Ofcom in their decision didn't actually find that online was material to the particular decision, and their research has shown that if you take the market as a whole, online is still behind the press and broadcasting in terms of its importance in media plurality. There is clearly a sense that it is something which needs to be taken into account in the short to medium term, and it will be taken into account in the current policy cycle in the UK. What the research has revealed is some dominance of free models, and particularly the public service broadcasters in the UK. And there's a debate about what the competition approach can achieve within that environment. Prevention of dominant positions, do you need some notion of essential facilities, for example, with certain intermediaries, and what kind of access remedies should be concerned? So I would say that net neutrality may be part of the solution, but endorse Robin Foster's conclusion from his Reuters report that we need more, at this stage, more dialogue between operators about plurality and the various policy measures that can be taken. We also need, I think, and this is relevant for the monitor, to think very carefully about the analytical dimensions taken into account. In particular, the degree of editorial control. Some intermediaries have very little editorial control, some have a great deal of editorial control. And we need to think about the whole value chain, from news creation through to exposure, including also the relationship between wholesale and retail providers and news flow, the tendency for news to flow between press and also online and broadcast outlets. I'll note in passing the limitations of frameworks that focus too much on the broadcasting reference point, for example, in Germany. Won't go into any detail. But just underline that point about editorial judgment. So new kinds of intermediaries, Facebook, Google, Twitter, do have potentially some editorial control in the way they present news and make decisions about what may be considered to be distasteful or unethical, what should be taken down. They operate those takedown policies. So there is some editorial judgment involved. But it's early in terms of moving from that observation to an observation that they should be subject to some kind of plurality control. However, just in closing, I would say that in a longer term view, a wider notion of media plurality, the very notion of preventing any one media owner having too much influence over public opinion and the political process, I think demands us to think in a more flexible way. Online is not like broadcasting and the press in terms of acting as an editorial gatekeeper on a key distribution platform. Online, along with other media increasingly, is involved in control and gathering of personal data about the process of opinion formation itself. So whereas issues of the intersection of issues of privacy and personal data and media plurality and freedom of expression was not so much of an issue in relation to press and broadcasting, it is that intersection of issues which I think we've only begun to grapple with. New media operators operating tools like semantic polling and presenting, whether it's Twitter public opinion quotes or Facebook charts, are involved in presenting public opinion and monitoring public opinion and making observation about the process of public opinion formation itself. And I think that is a new issue that we haven't in any way grappled with in the framework for assessing and monitoring media plurality. So we need new concepts, maybe not related to the notion of media plurality in its traditional sense, but certainly related to Meinungsmacht or media power or public opinion formation power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damien, for these, well, provocative ideas. May I just, before I open the floor, ask one thing for clarification? When it was about halfway your presentation, you mentioned online organizations. What exactly, could we go up to? So when Ofcom was asked whether online organizations had to be taken into account, and I'm wondering, what about BBC Online? Was it here?
Yeah. Ofcom, the Secretary of State asked 5 questions. That was a separate question about whether the BBC should be included in the assessment of
well, that's my second question. And then that's why on earth would you not include the BBC? It's something I don't really understand. But here you say include online organization within the definition of media enterprises. But what do you do with existing media enterprises online? They are considered online organizations, or do they refer here to, well, Facebook, Google, those who don't engage in media production? Is that what is meant here with online organizations? Okay.
So I think it was Ofcom's view, and it's certainly a widely held opinion, that Ofcom should be certainly part of the market assessment, and Ofcom also made the point that they should be sensitive to contextual factors like impartiality obligations, internal pluralism in those market assessments, but they shouldn't be subject to the limits. I'm not sure I answered your question fully, Peggy, sorry.
Well, yes, to some extent, but it's just that I'm always a bit confused about yeah, what are online organizations? I mean, broadcasters that I know, they offer their services on via cable, via satellite, via iPad. I can watch my Flemish TV channels on an iPad. Do they become then online organizations or a broadband organization or an iPad organization? So in my view, internet, but now I'm already entering the discussion, internet is just a platform.
But media enterprises here would be within the scope of the merger regime. So which has a definition of media enterprises. So this would be a scenario where a transaction involved a media enterprise, and this is a recommendation that the regime should be the definitions should include purely online, predicting that they could be more important to plurality considerations in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. So in order not to monopolize all the time, I will now give you the opportunity to ask some questions. I have a couple myself, but I would like to listen to you first. Yes, Giovanni.
Actually, I have two questions, one for Filippo Donati and one for Damien. And I don't know if I do both now or one by one. So for Filippo, about the advertising on the internet, the change of the legislation you were referring to, I suppose it was the law 103 of 2012, and which is a very interesting I mean approach. Don't know if I completely agree, but anyway, it's very interesting. I wanted to comment and then a question. The comment is that I think that this deals with the question of the relevant markets and the definition of the markets in the advertising in the internet advertising, and dealing also with the substitutability criteria. I mean, to understand what are exactly what are the competitors in and the substitutability from the advertising, from the supply side, and also from the demand side. My question is, do you what do you think about? And I wanted also to mention an interesting case in Norway, for example, where they decided to consider all the advertising that is produced on the web for the television content, for example, to consider it as television advertising, as well as the radio, as well as the print. So it's not internet advertising, but if it's on online content, then if it's an online video, then is merged with the television content. And by the way, for example, if we think about connected devices, connected TVs, if I have a linear service and then the advertising broadcasted in the linear service is TV advertising, but then if I switch to an on-demand service consuming from the same device, then is it advertising, internet advertising or TV advertising? So I wanted to know your opinion on that.
So my opinion is that this piece of legislation is quite unclear and uncertain, because the idea is to assess the existence of a dominant position between ISP, in particular search engines, and therefore we will have to wait for this investigation, which is now being carried out by the Italian authority, in order to verify how they understand which is the scope of the online advertising which has to be considered. But my position is that considering online advertising per se, so in general, so let's see how much advertising. We have seen figures of Google which were impressive in the US and in Europe, and probably Google for sure has a dominant position in online advertising, but this has nothing to do with the issue of pluralism. So we have to understand to which extent Google can be considered a content provider, And in this case, we could also make an assessment of his dominant position, but not, in general for everything that he does. I completely agree with you that what is online advertising, since the same product could be offered online and on TV and on radio, so that advertising, which has been repeated so many times, which kind of advertising is it? We can duplicate or triple but that's an open issue, a further issue triggered by this provision.
Thank you. Anna, you also had a question?
I had one for Damien.
You
I don't want to monopolize
sorry,
Okay. No, it was just a very quick question about the news expenditure slide you showed. I wanted to know if you have also some trends on these figures. This one, just to understand. The sense of the question is to understand if there is an impact of internet also in the resources that are invested in the production of original content in general and for news providing in particular.
This was a one-off report. There's no data at all on trends, but I think it was inferred that from this that there's no guarantee that online news production would continue, and that there's something of a squeeze of production at the same time as you have more plural distribution. But there's no data on trends that I'm aware of.
Okay, Anna, your turn now.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to start with what Morena said this morning, that you're reading 2 newspapers in the morning like you used to, but Lorena, sorry, and then you're using an aggregator. And this, I think, is really in the very center of the question of plurality, because I think it's like less plural than more plural. It just reminds me that my 9-year-old had to do some research on the internet, has occasionally to do some research on the internet for his school. And by now, he knows that he has to go to Google. And when he goes to Google, wherever there is Wikipedia, that's the right thing to copy-paste, because that's what gives you concise. So it's not very plural. He just looks at the Google page and picks up, because out of experience now he knows that even if he's looking for something on the coast of Tuscany and I don't know, some natural resources or something, the Wikipedia thing will be the most concise and valid one. So I think it's availability of information, but this is exactly, I think, what Damien touched upon, this availability versus consumption. So I think one question that was also discussed this morning was, even when you do the monitoring, you have to see how the news are constructed. So one question is how to ensure that you produce plural information over the internet, and this is very important. The other thing is the plurality and the consumption, and I don't think this can be regulated in any way. And this brings me to my second comment or question. Well, of course, I want to be provocative. I'm not that negative, but it reminds me of a recent discussion with public international law colleague here at the UI. He works on unmanned weapons, unmanned aerial vehicles, and this whole question of the drones bombing and who is responsible. Is it the person who is commanding the the airplane? Is it the person who decided that they should bomb? Since there's no pilot, there's no one who pressed the button on the plane to drop the bomb. And I was like, oh, come on, they should just, forbid this altogether. Obviously, there is not only an ethical issue, but a legal issue, who is responsible. So if there is a violation, what do you do? And I said, no, they should just, they should only allow drones to do radar things like they used to. And he said, you don't understand. They're going to do it anyway. So we have to find the second best or the third best solution on how to regulate this. And I think that's the same with the thing with the internet. I remember reading some papers about When you have information on a server, who is responsible? The guys who are running the server, the guys who are running the website, the person who posted the comment or the news. And there are, again, not only ethical or sociological issues that I know better, but also the legal issues of who is responsible. But I think the question is, you cannot regulate very well, like with the unmanned weapons, but it will happen anyway. So, I think we're on very shaky ground. So that's like, can you regulate it at all? That's my question.
Well, I mean, the point of monitoring and the point of understanding consumption, and you cannot regulate what people consume, but you can regulate, having monitored consumption, a transaction which merges two companies which have a dominant share of consumption. And that's fundamentally what's at stake. You can monitor consumption in order to see who is dominant. And then if two companies that are dominant want to merge, you can prevent that. Not positively and indefinitely, but it's probably better for it than nothing.
Yes, Lorena.
It's just to show what Damian just said. And following the example of your daughter, my daughter does the same, my son as well. But just try to go to the non-digital, to the analog world, and how we did it when we were children. How many encyclopedias were you checking, honestly? Voila! So that's it. And why? Well, now there is a progress, because you can check plenty of information. And if your daughter always goes to Wikipedia, it's because she has decided that for the moment, is the one that is offering the service that she likes. If at one point Wikipedia starts to drop in quality, and honestly, I'm a big defender of Wikipedia, there are studies that say that the reliability is incredibly high, she will switch to something else. And now it will be easy for her to switch, because it will just be selecting the next option in the Google search. In the past, you would go to the library and look for other encyclopedias, because your parents probably only had one. I think that was my case. So honestly, I don't see any need to regulate consumption. Something different is whether this is a tool to find whether there is dominance. Of course, it's like in the offline world, you measure market shares not only with supply but also with demand. So this is just economics. Sorry, I'm the optimistic on the internet.
Just some comments. First, on net neutrality, I know that there exists an important difference between net neutrality regulation between FCC and European Union or European Commission regarding the treatment of mobile internet. So in Europe, they do not make distinction between fixed internet and mobile internet. But in US, FCC actually maintains neutrality only for fixed internet, but does not maintain neutrality for mobile internet. It also has to do with the lobbying from Google. Google initially was a pro net neutrality, but Google became main actor in mobile phone industry. So Google and I think Verizon, they teamed up. They made some suggestion for net neutrality regulation, which was eventually accepted by FCC. So FCC basically relaxed this regulation regarding mobile internet. From my understanding, the main reason is that mobile internet, you have a much lower bandwidth compared to fixed internet. So probably here there is more issue of efficient management of traffic, and also it has to do, perhaps efficient management might induce the more entry of content which consumes very intensively the bandwidth. So there is some trade-off here, because if my understanding is correct, the reason why they relaxed net-neutral regulation on mobile network is if by giving like more freedom to operators, if they can induce more entry of content which consumes intensively bandwidth, that's there is a kind of trade-off here. So the second remark is about news aggregator. Actually, I have written a paper on news aggregator. I just want to report a very interesting situation in Korea. So in Korea, I told you that we have two domestic search engines which have a very high market share. And there is very informal, I saw very informal statistics about the share of these two search engines in terms of traffic to newspapers. So you take all the online traffic to newspapers, and you compute how much of this traffic come from the two search engines. The first one occupies 70%. The second one occupies 15%. So basically, they monopolize the traffic to newspapers. So there is a huge imbalance within Korea because there are some in particular right-wing newspapers which are extremely powerful in terms of political influence. But this number one search engine maybe makes much more money perhaps. But in terms of I mean political influence, they did not have anything. But certainly because of this new technology, they became a sort of media player with huge influence. And in particular, number one search engine made 3 times reforms of the way they show the different news content. And each time they try to adopt a new model, there's all kinds of debates, and all newspapers talk about it. But I think really this is a very really fascinating phenomenon.
I mean, we obviously have a debate about search engine transparency as regards competition, and a series of cases about whether Google is recommending its own services over others. And I think you have a very interesting debate about the extent to which search in particular can promote news, and whether or not there is any sense that an editorial decision is being hidden away in an algorithm is an interesting one. But where you have that dominance, there's a strong argument, at the very least, for transparency and some kind of public accountability process around those issues. So another observation that I made when I saw your slide this morning, which I couldn't read a word of, where you showed the homepage of the Korean Google, the Korean search page, they seem to be running news on the search page. Is that the case? So on that you go to the search page and you get a load of news stories. So potentially, there would be a public interest question around whether there is some sort of editorial decision hidden away in the algorithm when you search for a term, but also a secondary issue about whether everybody who goes to that search page gets a load of news stories anyway. And the point made in the report that I discussed by Robin Foster that I would recommend in this area is that it's too soon to take any regulatory action potentially around these issues. But if you look at the tendency, and this is something that we're quite sensitive about in the UK at the moment, for large media companies, particularly in the press sector, to leverage their market position in terms of getting regulatory benefits and exercising political power through promoting certain policy positions, you can see at least potentially a search engine using their own power in a similar way. So Robin Foster recommends a dialogue about what intermediaries, including search providers, should not do. For example, and you could make the argument that they should be transparent about their algorithm and that they shouldn't carry news stories on their homepage if they're dominant, and that may be the focus of some kind of regulatory activity or monitoring.
Yeah. So the question why we have a different regulation in the US between fixed mobile and fixed network and mobile networks is linked to the reason that mobile networks normally have less bandwidth, so they need more data management, traffic management. But having said that, the FCC has acknowledged that this distinction now is, fading. So they are going to, the idea is that in the future they will treat in a similar way fixed and mobile networks. For instance, the transparency rule applies both to fixed and mobile networks, and also the rules concerning blocking or degrading traffic now is different, but in the future will apply equally. So the idea is that mobile networks need sometimes to manage the traffic in order to avoid bottlenecks or traffic congestions, and those problems are not anymore present in fixed networks, but it will change in the future probably.
Okay, I've been told that coffee has been served, but there's one more remark from Maya.
Just a very, very short one, because it was mentioned by Damien, I think, the issue of editorial control as one of the leading issues on that, and so I wanted to have the privilege to ask a question about how you think that this could match the fact that on the internet the main principle is that there is no ex-ante responsibility. So how do you merge these two issues? I mean, the e-commerce directive is based on the fact that responsibility appears under certain conditions, and editorial responsibility is defined in the AVMS directive as effective editorial control, which is something we have been discussing about for years. So it's really, I have the feeling that we are coming back to ABC again, and which worries me a little bit, because it was so difficult, and we ended up with many complex constructions about finding out who is taking the decision. It's a little bit about the bombs and the drowning you were mentioning. So in the internet, we have many people that can press these buttons, but in the end, and then here I'm speaking as a regulator, I have to choose one subject. I can't just send requests and orders to an indefinite number of subjects. I must be sure who is the responsible one before I order something. So this, I'm sorry, I'm so practical, and I oblige you to come down from your ivory tower thoughts sometimes, but I need some pragmatism and
okay.
really
I think the answer to the question is really very simple. Obviously, under the e-commerce directive, liability for online content only is incurred with notice, and there is a mere conduit status is a very important kind of freedom to protect. But and I have to push back a little bit on your attempt to drag me out of the ivory tower, because it's very important that what Peggy is doing and what the centre are doing is monitoring. Okay, it's diagnosis, and that's a very separate thing to a question of the examples I gave. What the regulator does in relation to a decision. The monitoring question could lead to some kind of negotiations. It could lead to some kind of questions being raised, and it's related to the standards which are established in regulatory decision making, but it's a separate thing. This is a piece of research about what level of plurality is effective in a given media market. in the context of advice to decisions being made elsewhere. So it's a different thing, and it's not providing the backdrop to a decision which could be judicially reviewed at any kind. And I think that we need to link monitoring to the research in a regulatory context, but it also needs to have some freedom from that.
And then the very final question.
I don't want to keep you from coffee, so I'm going to limit myself to 2 remarks only.
I'm not Italian, so I don't mind waiting a bit for the
Okay, so a question slash remark to Professor Donati first. You mentioned that in the case of regulating internet service providers or content providers, we should make a distinction between transactions that are relevant or related to the marketplace of ideas and transactions that are not. Do you think that this line is easy to draw? Because I was thinking about, for example, the examples you mentioned, the case of Amazon or eBay. But for example, Amazon in the US has recently acquired the Washington Post. So if I have my Kindle e-reader, a different market, but closely related, and I want to buy news, and I want to use the Kindle to read news online, and Amazon offers supposedly only the Washington Post, is this a transaction that's completely irrelevant to the marketplace of ideas? So I think that this is a very blurry picture or a very difficult line to draw there. And then about the role of competition law that you mentioned in conducting competition law analysis and integrating pluralism considerations there. I think that there is a lot of work to be done, and you mentioned the Google case as an example of abuse of a dominant position. I think that considering the personalized search model, for example, and the way that Google gets access to user data to inform other services or to provide better search results to the consumers, or even better mail services, etc., then why, instead of focusing on the advertising markets that may, in cases, provide even arbitrary results, consider whether and to what extent Google and other search engines or internet service providers or content providers get access to user data and conduct an abuse of dominant position analysis on the basis of that. And this supposedly would also take into account what Sunstein calls information cocoons. When we get search results that fit only our existing predispositions. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done on competition law on that. Thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you very much, and I would now like to invite you for coffee, but before that, let's join me in thanking our speakers again for their thought-provoking presentation. Thank you.
I see we're very disciplined. We even did a shorter coffee break than normal. I take this to be a positive sign of interest to the topic. Anyway, I think we're getting now to the third of the three pillars that Pierluigi outlined this morning. We talked about access, we talked about regulation, and now we talked about the subjects or the operators, that promote or do not promote plurality. I'll give the floor immediately to Oreste Pollicino from the Bocconi University.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the really kind invitation and for the outstanding discussion that there's been until now that helped me in speaking less. First of all, because many issues that I wanted to raise have been already raised, and especially in the last panel, and also because I have two outstanding speakers after me, and I want to give as soon as possible the floor to them and then to the participants. So the central question of this presentation is how protection of pluralism on the internet impacts over internet service provider. I will try to distinguish two sides of the story, the supranational one and the national one. Clearly the problems are different and I have not the time here to go in depth in all the details, but just to give you a scenario. With regard to the supranational dimension, especially the European one perspective, the question is how protection of pluralism on the internet, the impacts over internet service provider is very close to the other another question, to another issue, whether the relevant provisions that are contained in the already mentioned Directive 2031 do provide an appropriate protection for the users and for the operators. Clearly now it's at stake the relationship between law and technology. The first answer would be quite easy to give. The legal framework entrusted in the directive reflected a scenario where the ISP did not usually perform any control over the data and information. I will go back to this issue when we speak about the national dimension. Now I want to raise just a remark on the supranational dimension, saying that against this legal scenario, it seems that is emerging a kind of hybridization, technical hybridization for the internet service provider, especially from a technical point of view. What do I mean with it? That clearly that it's quite difficult. For sure it's more difficult than 13 years ago identifying the different roles that ISP may perform. If this is true, it's very connected to this problem, the forced inertia of the political powers, the legislative powers, and sometimes of the regulators, despite the wonderful job that is doing the Commission and also the national regulators. There is sometimes a forced inertia due to some problems related, for example, to the competence. And then, in this lack of action, it's emerging the judicial action as first attempt to deal with this issue. And when you deal with this issue, you clearly deal with protection of fundamental rights in internet and balancing between contrasting fundamental rights. So what I want to say in relation to the supranational dimension is that it's always more clear that there is a judicial based, or at least a judicial driven process due to what I mentioned, forced inertia of the political powers. And this is true, especially with regard to freedom of expression and its limits. Then the question is quite clear. How the European courts are addressing the problem of pluralism and freedom of expression in internet. I don't want here to go in the details, but I want to say that it's the dialogue between the European courts, it's always a little bit more complex, because the Strasbourg court, that until 2 or 3 years ago was not so active in these fields, is starting to be always more active and dealing with exactly the same issues that are the focus of the European Court of Luxembourg. I will mention only here the Delphi case that many of you for sure knows. Internet service provider in Estonia has been condemned by the judicial court, Supreme Court in Estonia, because it didn't delete the comments of users. It was absolutely functioning notice and take down system. The reason, because it was condemned, it didn't delete before the first notice. The court didn't find any violation of Article 10 of the Convention. I cannot now go into the details, but I just ask, first of all, to myself, and then to you, what would have decided the Court of Justice in the same case? Different parameters for the two courts, different legal frameworks. The European Convention, the European Courts of Human Rights has a provision that is like a constitutional provision, Article 10 of the Convention, that gives a very margin of discretion, very broad margin of discretion in dealing with this issue, and especially gives the possibility to deal with the technical issue in a much, let's say, clear and actual way than the European Court of Luxembourg, that has a different parameters. The directive that, as I will say in 2 minutes, is not maybe the perfect legal scenario in terms of activity and role of internet providers today. But if this is true with regard to the supranational dimension, and so if it's true that the multi-level judicial dialogue related to protection of fundamental rights in internet is in action, it has huge theoretical implications and also practical consequence for pluralism. How is the situation in Italy with regard to the same question? How protection of pluralism on the internet impacts on internet service provider? Not an easy answer, but the question has a concrete relevance, because on the one hand, the Italian legislator, as Filippo mentioned earlier, has extended the definition of the relevant market of communication, what is called integrated system of communication, that before, with regard to the internet world, included only the electronic publishing, and now is extended to the revenues that are collected through online advertising, even search engines, social network, a user-generated content platform. But it's also relevant not only from a legislative point of view, but also from a regulatory point of view, because the Authority of Guarantee of Communication in 2010 had launched a consultation in which the final act has been distinguished with regard to the methodology, which are the market, the sectors that are relevant for pluralism, and which are the sectors that are relevant for competition. And as recently affirmed, that there is the idea to go far beyond the electronic publishing sector in internet, and maybe including all the form of information which characterize internet. So it's something that is on the table at the legislative and the regulatory levels. In the light of this background, which is the relevant question, is it possible to limit the inclusion in the integrated system, communication system of the operators in the internet, so of the web players that have no editorial control, just in relation to the protection, in relation to the perspective that has to do with protection of competition, and not with the perspective that is related to the protection of pluralism? In other words, it's possible to read the new provision as having only an effect on protection of competition and not an effect on protection of pluralism? Now, in order to answer to these questions, it's important to focus on two intermediate research questions. The first one, it's possible to affirm that in our legal regime, pluralism has an autonomous logic and legal dimension in respect to the need to protect competition? In other words, pluralism in our domestic legal regime has an autonomous relevance, or should be always connected to protection of competition? I think that the answer should be positive, at least for two reasons. The first one is the same official text on audiovisual media service that at paragraph 43, at the article 43, paragraph 5, says that the Authority of Communication guarantees and enacts all the needed acts in order to eradicate or avoid, on the one hand, dominant position, or in any case, position that will in any case damage the pluralism. So, the autonomous relevance of pluralism is acknowledged by the legislator. The same autonomy is acknowledged by the Authority for Communication Guarantees, because in the consultation that I mentioned earlier has been used an analysis methodology, a methodology analysis, to measure the power of market players with respect to both, in autonomous way, competition on the one hand and pluralism on the other one. And footnote, one sector, yearbook publishing sector, annuaristica for the Italians, has been found as relevant for one, competition, and not for the other one, pluralism. So internet would not be the first sector that would be relevant for competition, but not relevant for pluralism. Now, once that we clarified, or I hope clarified that pluralism has an autonomous dimension in the relevant legislation with regard to internet, what about ISP and internet? Should all the internet world include in the legal regime or not? I deem not, because until now, the grounds on which relevant markets in our SIC were included, they were included in the scope of analysis because they were related to the exercise of a control. Exercise of a control over contents. So, until now, I would say all, maybe some other could say most, of the operators that are subject, that are into the scope of application of the SIC are there exactly because, in a way or in the other one, have a control or a potential control on the contents, have editorial control. So, if an operator has not an editorial control, should not be there. Okay, this could be the end of my presentation if the sync would not be a little bit more complicated in practice. Because it's true that Directive 2031 gives an exemption to certain conditions to the ISP, but it's also true that these provisions turn, in most of the case, outdated. Why? Because as Maya Capello said before, ISP have implemented the new business model, and it's not always very clear the assumption that ISP have no relation with contents. So if this is true, and there is this kind of hybridization, remain a point that should be dealt. The fact that the control over contents remain the main criteria to distinguish what should be and what should not be inside the SIC. That could be another objection. We have a jurisprudential, a judicial case law that differentiate active and passive internet service provider. Has this kind of distinction any impact on the criteria of editorial control? This is one of my last questions. I think not. I think not, because in the relevant case law that I cannot now express in details, all the times that have been condemned an ISP to be active was not because there was a lack of content control. So not because it was a lack of a control ex ante, that is typical of an editorial activity, but only because it didn't quickly removed ex post the material that was deemed as, for example, in contrast of copyright. So the active provider has to behave in a certain way, but in ex post dimension, to not be responsible. In particular, he has to act without the notice of a formal authority, while the passive provider can wait for this formal communication. But I want to stress again this point, always in ex post dimension and never in ex ante dimension. That is what is characterizing the editorial activity. Then, if all this is true, I will conclude with a remark that brings me to say that there could be some contradictory consequence if the path that has been started by the recent legal and regulatory reform could be continued. So if the ISP will be really in the scope of application of integrated communication system, which are these contradictory consequences? The first one, ISP is not considered per se as relevant to the SIC, but only to the extent it collects revenues from online advertising. This means that not all the providers, but only those who are on the register of communication operators are subject to the assessment of their power on the relevant market. Final paradox. It could be strange that the operator like internet service provider, in the case they have not editorial control, but then it would become content providers. It would be quite strange that those kind of operators could be considered to be relevant to the protection of pluralism, while, on the other hand, the e-commerce directive provides liability exemption on the assumption that no control over contents is performed by them. So, at the end, the last remark, be careful to make even broader the base of calculation, because it has been already proved that this kind of approach was not at all effective. So if we really want to open more the base of calculation, including even more revenues, the risk is to be even more ineffective. The only way to be really effective is enforcing the first paragraph of Article 43 in the relevant position. So without any, so the provision that say they should be kept, they should be considered relevant, the single dominant position in the single market. So if and this I would like to know the opinion also of Maya, if this paragraph will be really enforced, then it's possible that the things could change. But if the trend will remain the same, maybe this new trend would not help to improve the things, but would be counterproductive. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Oreste, for a provocative, asking the questions and, actually giving us different answers. I give the floor now to Peggy. Peggy, welcome.
Thank you. Could you please put up my presentation? It's on the computer.
Peggy, please.
Well, I have all my stuff
okay.
here, so yeah, but you just closed it. Okay, thank you. So what I would like to do in my presentation is I'm going to sit in my ivory tower for a while, and then I try to come out of it and look a bit at what has been proposed or what is covered in the Media Convergence Green Paper and what the reactions were, and then we'll climb the ivory tower again. So what I would like to add to this debate is let's look at media pluralism regulation as a form of scarcity regulation. Pluralism regulation as scarcity regulation. And this is actually not my idea. It's something that I stole or copied from one of my favorite authors these days, Kari Karppinen, who himself refers to Stefan Verhulst. And he wrote that historically the debate on media pluralism and diversity has largely been premised on the idea that the media act as powerful intermediaries or gatekeepers of public communication flows. And it's the fact that scarcity imposes power. And because of scarcity, the intermediaries that control markets are in a privileged position to exercise power and shape the public opinion. I think this could be a very good starting point to look at current bottlenecks for media pluralism. But before turning to those, let's take a look at the analog world. What were the scarcity, forms of scarcity in the analog world, and how have they been remedied? I'm not 100% satisfied with this scheme because it's not. I'm not 100% satisfied because, but let me explain what the idea behind it is. Well, first of all, I think, well, I've put PSB there in the middle, across the different chains in the media industry value chain, which here obviously is focused on audiovisual media, broadcasting. Public service broadcasting has been installed in Western Europe as a solution to the scarcity of frequencies, of capacity available. So there was a public monopoly installed, and then as a counterbalance, this public monopoly had to provide all kinds of programs in the general interest, cater for the different interests in society. And so they were responsible for production, for the aggregation, and for the distribution. And then we saw the emergence of new distribution modes, cable satellite, introduction of commercial TV. But then again, new forms of scarcity emerged, and those were again tackled with regulatory solutions, like program obligations or third-party emissions, because there were not hundreds of commercial broadcasters, so some smaller groups in society who did not have the means to install their own radio station or TV station and could then get access to existing channels and provide their own programs. Or there were scarcity also in terms of transmission time or in terms of finances. And there we had these quota for European works installed at EU level because there was a fear that in our limited transmission time and limited number of channels that we would only see US series and US programs. So here again, a remedy was installed in order to overcome that scarcity. So forcing broadcasters to invest in terms of money and in terms of time in European works and in independent works as well, so that our independent production sector, that the audiovisual production sector in Europe would survive. Subsidies have also been a means to overcome certain forms of scarcity, especially financial scarcities. Scarcity can also be artificially created through copyright. Yeah, so pay TV operators putting a lot of money on the table for exclusive content, and that was then counterbalanced with lists of major events, short news reporting. And then also on the side of distribution and networks, there were forms of scarcity which were then tried to remedy those with must carry and access obligations, standards, obligations for conditional access service providers, and so on. And then I have put also at the bottom ownership rules. So in order to ensure that there would not be scarcity in terms of the number of broadcasts or in numbers of distributors out there, prohibition of undue concentration rules were installed, media ownership rules. And you see the 3 dots there to indicate that this is not an exhaustive list. This is just to bring you in the mode of thinking about pluralism remedies as regulation that tries to tackle scarcity, be it because the market cannot provide or because of artificially created scarcity, because of copyright reasons, and so on. And then for a while it was said that with the advent of the internet and new communication channels, mobile outlets and so on, we would now live in a world of digital abundance. And scholars have called it the age of plenty or information paradise, communicative abundance. McNair says that we have witnessed a period in which, or shift from ideological control to cultural chaos. And there's of course also the seminal, is it the right word, seminal, or the landmark work of Castells, who talks about mass self-communication. So we are all empowered now to distribute our opinions. The threshold is, thanks to the internet, has become so low to distribute content that we have produced ourselves. So when you look at content creation, scarcity has been solved thanks to user-generated content that can freely flow over the internet. When it comes to content packaging, you have new operators coming to the market, Google with YouTube, AOL, MySpace. Also with regard to infrastructure, you have internet providers, mobile operators who now offer alternatives for scarcity or forms of scarcity that once were. Is that, well, really the case? Of course not. I think scholars have written, or several scholars have written about the new forms of scarcity that also emerge today. And I'm not going to discuss this in detail. I would really like to recommend you to read the survey of the different scholarly arguments that have been made in the article of Karppinen in Observatorio, which he published already in 2009. But this, I liked to put some quotes here. And so there are scholars who refer to the fact that even with the internet, you still have these forms of concentration, and that if you look at what is actually consumed on the internet, that it's still a limited number of sources, a limited number of providers offering the content that is actually being consumed on the internet. Baker wrote that the online world tends to be even more concentrated than the conventional media world, because this is a result of the economies of scale and network effects that the economists can undoubtedly better explain than me, but that are inherent in network industries and also the internet. And then you also have Sunstein with his works on the echo chambers, so that we all live in our own information bubble and not really connect to the others anymore, that the public sphere is being fragmented these days. And Lorena, I must say that I admire you, because you said, when I have breakfast these days, I read my the newspapers I read before, El País and what was it, Financial Times, and you check all the flipboards and all the news reports that interest you. How long do you have breakfast? Wow, that's amazing. Well, the thing is that I probably, or studies at least show that most people are not like you, unfortunately, that even, well, in today's world where there is, in theory, there's more choice, people tend to choose less diverse. And so there have been studies, they are cited by Nathalie Hellberger in her, I'm going to include some more product placement here for the Journal of Media Law, of which Rachel is one of the editors. But Nathalie Hellberger of the University of Amsterdam wrote an excellent article in the, was it the first issue of last year's series of Journal of Media Law on exposure diversity as a policy goal. And so there she describes how a number of studies that looked at, do people really choose differently if there is more choice out there? And there was, she refers to, amongst others, a study of the German audience's use of EPGs, so to stay in the traditional TV world for a while. This study found that many users respond to increased digital channel variety with simplification strategies, so concentrating on what they know, appreciate, and they don't really explore new channels that are being added. And the same or similar studies that looked at online consumption found similar, or came to similar conclusions. So despite immense diversity of content available, audience tends to concentrate on a relatively small handful of sites. And it apparently even has to do with your profile or your education, and paradoxically, a study of Dutch and Irish media audiences showed that exposure to a greater variety of news media resulted in more diverse consumption for less educated respondents, while the effect on better educated respondents was apparently less. And so you can check these studies, are quoted by Nathalie Hellberger, but it's striking. And so there's studies show there's a reduced exposure as a result of the coping with abundant strategies. Oh, there's so much out there, so let's stick to what we know, to what we're familiar with. So those are new forms of scarcity that are inherent in us as human beings. Our time is limited, our attention span is limited. But there also remain forms of scarcity that have to do, or that are continuance of old forms of scarcity. Access restrictions, for instance. So free TV is still out there, but is starting to become marginalized in a way, because what content copyright owners try to do is, of course, to market their product and to earn as much money as possible. It's normal, I guess. You can't blame them for it, but they very often require a remuneration for each form of exploitation of public communication. And so what you see is that you get this access regimes based on how did I call it, the context or the medium limited and time limited use of content. And so there are, thanks to digital rights management, a lot of restrictions on what you can actually consume, and this has of course mainly to do with professional content. There are obstacles to genuine exposure diversity because of the price that you pay for access. And the price is not always in euros or in dollars, but very often also under the form of reduced autonomy or giving away your personal data. And are users willing to do that? Not always, but people that are not always aware of it, but those who are aware are not always willing to pay that price. And she also describes the obstacles that result from so-called path dependencies. It has already been raised before. Once you have given your preferences, I bought once, okay, perhaps twice or three times clothes or shoes on Zalando. This is a well-known web shop in Belgium, also in Germany, I believe. Each website who has these targeted ads show me promotions of Zalando. I'm sick and tired, but how do I switch that off? Can someone explain it to me? So I'm in this locked in because of my previous preference, or because I did once, I bought once or twice, perhaps, yeah, okay, I admit, on Zalando. Yeah, okay, you have to show me. But it comes back all the time. I did it once and I can't stop it. So there are still obstacles or forms of scarcity that hinder real exposure diversity, or real genuine diverse, because I use the term exposure diversity because this has been claimed by several scholars before, that is the ultimate goal. If we try to foster diversity in sources, in distribution means, in content, it is ultimately because we want citizens to be confronted and to be to actually consume this diversity of media contents out there in order to take up their role in society. Okay, let's skip this but it is basic just to give some examples of how personalized media and algorithms are more and more steering our media consumption. And I'm also referring here to the work of Ellie Pariser on the filter bubbles, and then Joseph Thoreau's book, The Daily You, which I can